couple years ago, we had enormous tax cuts for the wealthy, writing off private jets and yachts and giveaways, and it was going to be paid for by oil and gas leases that were supposed to be, as Senator Murkowski said, in the tens of billions of dollars. And what we're hearing today is about $6 million of that has been covered. I'm correct in putting those pieces of information?
That is correct.
And so for all of our folks that have a lot to say about fiscal responsibility, this is a debt that has been left unpaid. And when we talk about having to take EBT away, WIC away, people's health care away, perhaps the thing that we should be taking away are a lot of these goodies and giveaways to the wealthiest people in our society when we said that these bills were going to be paid, and 5 years on, 6 years on, they've been left unpaid. Dr. Feldges, thank you for joining us here today. As you know, the 2017 Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, under President Trump, opened the Arctic refuge to oil and gas development and mandated 2 lease sales on the refuge's coastal plain, an area known to the Gwich'in people as, quote, the sacred place where life begins. The revenues from drilling in the Arctic refuge were included in that bill as an offset for slashing taxes for corporations and high wealth Americans. And so in order to, quote unquote, pay for all of these tax cuts for the rich, the then Republican majority said, in order to pay for this and offset it, we know exactly what we're going to do. We are going to sell oil and gas leases on the Arctic refuge, which has historically always been protected land, and that will cover the bill. At the time, Senator Murkowski touted that opening the refuge to the extraction will, quote, generate tens of billions of dollars in revenue for the United States government. Leave carbon emissions aside, leave the destruction of this precious land aside. This was going to be a moneymaker in terms of oil and gas. On January 6th of 2021, in addition to other events that happened that day, the Trump administration held the first ever lease sale on the refuge's coastal plain, attracting bids on only half of offered leases. Ultimately, only 2 small oil companies and an Alaska state-owned corporation bid on and received leases. In 2022, the 2 oil companies asked for refunds on their leases, leaving the state-owned company, Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority, or IDA, as the sole leaseholder in the refuge. Dr. Feldges, can you confirm how much revenue the Arctic Refuge Oil and Gas Program has generated for the federal government compared to the original estimates?
Sure. The lease sale itself on the day of the lease sale brought in about $14 million in high bids. 2 of those bids were subsequently withdrawn by one of the bidders, so that brought in about $12 million. But the federal government only receives 50% of the revenue, so the federal government received about $6 million from that sale.
About $6 million, even on the high end, even if you take 100% of that cut from that 14 to 15 million, that's still less than 1% of the CBO estimates that the then Republican majority said would pay for all of these tax cuts for the wealthy. Can you briefly explain the rationale given by the 2 companies when they requested cancellation and refunds on their 2 leases?
Unfortunately, I cannot speak to their motivations for that.
Does the state development company, IDA, have a history of successfully developing projects on their oil and gas leases? Just yes or no?
I'm not familiar with that.
No, so they don't even successfully develop projects on these leases. And has the National Wildlife Refuge ever been managed for oil and gas purposes before? Has there ever been such a case since?
To my knowledge, this is the only example of a refuge having an oil and gas purpose added to its statutory.
On leases in the Arctic refuge, it is well established that the Secretary of the Interior has authority to cancel leases that were issued in violation of statute or regulation. And as mentioned previously, the Interior Department recently found that the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority's leases were issued with serious legal deficiencies in the underlying analyses. Mr. Ichok, can you talk about what impacts that flawed or faulty analyses might have on communities that would experience the impacts of oil and gas development? What is at stake here?
Thank you, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez. I think I could talk about this all day, but I'll offer two examples. First, the failure to fully account for climate emissions associated with Arctic drilling is having and will continue to have very real impacts on Arctic communities. We know the Arctic is warming, as I said earlier, 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. Changing weather patterns are threatening traditional food sources. For instance, rain and ice events have caused caribou die-offs from ingesting ice shards. Thawing permafrost is threatening infrastructure and the ability to safely store traditional food sources. Secondly, and relatedly, the failure to fully analyze the impacts of development on access to traditional food sources has very real consequences on the physical health and cultural well-being of communities whose very existence depends on the healthy porcupine herd and all of the animals and wildlife within the refuge.
And as you had alluded to, many of these communities that bear the burden of both the development and the impacts of climate change too often become sacrifice zones for the rest of the country. Some of our most vulnerable communities are also the ones that are at shorelines or exposed to very vulnerable habitats as well. In the context of fossil fuel development, we often hear the argument that these communities must allow the development of their oil and gas resources in order to thrive, that there's simply no other way. Do you agree with that general argument or assessment? And if not, why?
I don't believe with that general assessment. And, I need to disclose that I am a shareholder of the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. I'm a shareholder of the Doyon Corporation. I referenced earlier that I'm a Nup'ak descent. I'm not here representing the Nup'ak people or the people of the North Slope. I'm here representing the conservation communities and the Wilderness Society. But to answer your question, as a person that grew up in Alaska and have been involved with subsistence hunting for walrus, seals, caribou, and whales, and also have worked for a native corporation, I do believe that those resources are not needed for us to survive. We have some of the highest rates of suicide, heart disease, per capita. We have all these other ailments that our current systems are failing to provide the adequate resources. That I don't see how more drilling and more money is going to improve those services, considering that we're already at the peak performance and leading the production of oil and gas, and our people have been living in the Arctic and are adaptive and resilient, and have shown by living there since time immemorial that we can survive without these resources. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back to the chair.